The auction hammer was about to fall on 450 acres of my grandfather's land when I burst through the courthouse doors, clutching a crumpled inheritance letter and breathing so hard I thought my lungs might explode. Every eye in that room turned to stare at the 18-year-old girl who had just interrupted what should have been a routine cattle liquidation sale. My cousin Brandon Peterson stood at the front, his face going white as he saw me there, holding the proof that he had no right to sell what belonged to me. But let me back up, because this story doesn't start with me saving my inheritance at the last possible second. It starts 3 weeks earlier when I was living in my final foster placement, counting down the days until I aged out of the system with nowhere to go and no family to speak of. I had been shuffled through 12 different homes since I was 7 years old, when my parents died in a car accident that left me completely alone in the world. Or so I thought. I was sitting in the cramped bedroom I shared with two other girls at Helen Cooper's group home, folding my few belongings into a duffel bag, when Helen knocked on the door. She held a manila envelope in her weathered hands, the kind of official-looking mail that usually meant bad news for kids like me. My name was written across the front in careful cursive, along with an address I had never seen before. Helen sat down on the edge of my narrow bed and handed me the envelope. Her gray eyes were softer than usual, which immediately put me on edge. Helen Cooper had been running group homes for 20 years, and she didn't do soft unless something was seriously wrong. The letter inside was from a law office in a small town called Millbrook, about 300 miles from where I had spent my entire life bouncing between foster families. The lawyer, a man named Charles Cook, explained that my grandfather, Edward Anderson, had passed away 6 months earlier and left me his entire farm, 450 acres of land, a farmhouse, 2 barns, and a herd of cattle that had been in our family for 3 generations. I read that letter 5 times before the words started to make sense. I had a grandfather. He had been alive until 6 months ago. He had left me everything he owned, and I had never known he existed. Helen watched me process this information with the patience of someone who had delivered plenty of life-changing news to teenagers over the years. When I finally looked up at her, she asked the question I was afraid to voice myself. Why had I never known about him? Why had no one ever told me I had family? The answer came in a second letter, this one written in my grandfather's own shaky handwriting. He explained that he had tried to gain custody of me after my parents died, but my father's family had fought him in court. They claimed he was too old, too isolated, too set in his ways to raise a child. The legal battle had dragged on for months, and by the time it was over, I had already been placed in foster care, and the system had decided it was better to leave me where I was rather than uproot me again. My grandfather wrote that he had never stopped thinking about me, never stopped hoping that someday we would meet. He had followed my progress through the system as much as the law would allow, always planning to reach out when I turned 18 and could make my own decisions. But cancer had taken him before that day came. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story gets even more intense, and I want to know if you've ever discovered family you never knew existed. Reading his words felt like finding a piece of myself I never knew was missing. He described memories of my father as a boy, stories about the farm where my dad had grown up, traditions that had been passed down through generations of our family. He had saved newspaper clippings about my academic achievements, somehow keeping track of a granddaughter he was never allowed to know. The third piece of mail in that envelope was a photograph, creased and faded from being handled so many times. It showed a man with kind eyes and calloused hands standing in front of a white farmhouse, with rolling green fields stretching out behind him. On the back, in that same careful handwriting, were the words, "For my granddaughter Sandra, when she finally comes home." I spent that entire night staring at that photograph, trying to see my father's face in my grandfather's features, trying to imagine what my life might have been like if the court case had gone differently. Helen found me the next morning still sitting on my bed, surrounded by the scattered contents of that manila envelope. She helped me make the phone call to Charles Cook's office. The lawyer's voice was gentle but professional as he explained the details of the inheritance. The farm was mine, free and clear, along with all the equipment and livestock. There was even a small savings account that would help me get started. But there was one problem that made my stomach drop as he explained it. My cousin, Brandon Peterson, my father's nephew, had been managing the property since my grandfather's death. He had legal authority to make decisions about the livestock and equipment until I claimed my inheritance. Charles Cook's voice grew tense as he explained that Brandon had recently filed paperwork to sell the cattle herd, claiming it was necessary to pay for feed and maintenance costs. The sale was scheduled for the following week. I hung up that phone call with a sick feeling in my stomach. After 18 years of having nothing, I had finally inherited something that connected me to my family, only to discover that it might be stripped away before I could even see it. Helen could see the panic in my eyes, and she did something that surprised me. She offered to drive me to Millbrook herself. The 300-mile drive gave me plenty of time to think about what I was walking into. I had never lived anywhere but the city, never been around farm animals, never even seen 450 acres of land all in one place. What was I supposed to do with a cattle ranch when I didn't know the first thing about ranching? Maybe Brandon Peterson was right to sell the herd. Maybe I was in over my head before I even started. But every time those doubts crept in, I would pull out that photograph of my grandfather and remember his words about coming home. He had believed I belonged there, even when he couldn't be there to show me how. Millbrook turned out to be the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and news of Edward Anderson's granddaughter arriving spread faster than wildfire. Helen and I stopped at the first diner we saw to ask for directions to the farm, and within minutes the entire restaurant was staring at us with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. The waitress, a woman named Ruth Lee, who looked like she had been working there since the building was constructed, poured us coffee without being asked and settled into the booth across from us. She had known my grandfather for 40 years, she explained, and she remembered my father as a boy. Her eyes filled with tears as she talked about how heartbroken Edward had been when he lost the custody battle. Ruth told us things that no legal document could have conveyed. How my grandfather had kept my father's bedroom exactly as he had left it when he moved away for college. How he had continued to set two places at the dinner table every night, just in case his son decided to come home for a visit. How he had talked about his granddaughter to anyone who would listen, always believing that someday we would be reunited. But Ruth also warned us about Brandon Peterson. He had been circling the property like a vulture ever since my grandfather's health started declining, always offering to help with this or that, always positioning himself to inherit what he felt should have been his father's share of the family land. When my grandfather's will was read and everything went to me instead, Brandon had been furious. The drive from town to the farm took us down a winding country road lined with ancient oak trees. When we finally turned into the long gravel driveway, I got my first glimpse of the place my grandfather had called home for 70 years. The white farmhouse from the photograph sat on a small hill, surrounded by flower gardens that had grown wild without his care. Two red barns stood nearby, and beyond them stretched fields of green pasture that seemed to go on forever. Helen parked the car in front of the house, and we sat there for a moment in complete silence. The only sounds were the wind moving through the oak trees and the distant lowing of cattle somewhere beyond the barns. It was so quiet compared to the city that it felt like stepping into a different world entirely. Charles Cook met us at the front door with a ring of keys and a thick folder of paperwork. He was a tall, thin man with silver hair and the kind of steady presence that probably served him well in legal negotiations. As he led us through the house, he explained that my grandfather had spent his final months making sure everything was ready for my arrival. The farmhouse was larger than it looked from outside, with wide plank floors and windows that let in streams of golden afternoon light. The kitchen still smelled faintly of coffee and bacon, as if my grandfather had just stepped out for a moment. His coffee mug sat beside the sink, waiting to be washed. But it was my father's bedroom that broke my heart completely. My grandfather had preserved it exactly as Ruth described, like a shrine to the son he had lost. Model airplanes hung from the ceiling, and the walls were covered with ribbons from high school track meets and certificates from academic competitions. A letter jacket hung in the closet, still waiting for its owner to come home. Charles Cook watched me take in these details with the patience of someone who understood the weight of family history. When I was ready, he led us outside to see the barns and the pastures where my inheritance grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun. There were nearly 200 head of cattle, he explained, a mix of beef and dairy cows that represented decades of careful breeding and selection. That was when we saw Brandon Peterson's truck coming up the driveway, dust billowing behind it like a storm cloud. Brandon climbed out of his truck with the swagger of someone who felt entitled to be there. He was about 30 years old, with the kind of artificial friendliness that immediately put me on guard. He introduced himself as my cousin and offered condolences for my grandfather's death, but his eyes were calculating as they took in my appearance. He started talking immediately about the challenges of running a cattle operation, the expenses involved in maintaining the herd, the complexity of the business that someone my age couldn't possibly understand. He made it sound like he was doing me a favor by arranging to sell the cattle before they became my responsibility. Charles Cook interrupted him with the kind of firm politeness that lawyers perfect over years of dealing with difficult people. He reminded Brandon that the cattle belonged to me now, and any sale would require my explicit consent. Brandon's friendly mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the anger underneath. That was when I learned about the auction scheduled for the following week. Brandon had already arranged everything, he explained, advertising the sale and bringing in potential buyers from 3 counties. Canceling now would cost him money and reputation. He strongly suggested that I let the sale proceed as planned, for everyone's benefit. I looked out at those cattle grazing peacefully in my grandfather's fields, and something inside me rebelled against the idea of letting them be sold off like they meant nothing. These animals represented generations of my family's work, my grandfather's legacy, my connection to a heritage I was only just discovering. I told Brandon Peterson that there would be no sale. His reaction was immediate and ugly. He accused me of being naive, of not understanding the realities of farm life, of being an ungrateful city kid who would probably abandon the place within a month anyway. He said things about my grandfather that made Charles Cook step forward with his hand raised in warning. But what Brandon said next changed everything. He claimed that my grandfather had promised him the cattle herd years ago in recognition of all the work he had done maintaining the property. He said he had documentation to prove it, contracts that would override my grandfather's will. He was going to contest my inheritance in court, and in the meantime, he was going to proceed with the cattle sale as planned. That night, Helen and I stayed in a motel in town while I tried to figure out what to do next. Charles Cook had taken Brandon's threats seriously enough to start researching the legal precedents for inheritance disputes. He warned me that court battles could drag on for months or even years, and that Brandon might have enough legal standing to tie up my inheritance indefinitely. I spent hours walking around that motel room, trying to process everything that had happened in the span of a single day. I had gone from having no family and no future to inheriting a farm and discovering a cousin who wanted to take it away from me. I had found a home I never knew existed, only to learn that I might lose it before I ever really had it. But every time I considered just walking away, letting Brandon have what he wanted, and going back to my old life, I thought about my grandfather sitting alone in that farmhouse for 18 years, waiting for a granddaughter he was never allowed to know. I thought about my father's bedroom, preserved like a museum of lost possibilities. I thought about the cattle grazing peacefully in fields that had been in my family for generations. I called Charles Cook's office first thing the next morning and told him I wanted to fight. The next week passed in a blur of legal research and preparation. Charles Cook worked around the clock to build our case while I spent every day at the farm learning everything I could about the property I was fighting to keep. Helen had to return to her group home, but she left me with her phone number and a promise that I could call her anytime I needed support. Ruth Lee from the diner became my unofficial guide to Millbrook and its residents. She introduced me to the neighbors who had known my grandfather, the local feed store owner who had supplied his cattle for decades, the veterinarian who had treated his animals. Each conversation revealed more details about the man who had left me his legacy and the cousin who was trying to steal it. The picture that emerged was troubling. Brandon Peterson had indeed been helpful to my grandfather in his final years, but his motives had been far from altruistic. Several neighbors mentioned seeing him going through my grandfather's papers when the old man was too sick to supervise. The feed store owner, a man named Scott Allen, told me that Brandon had been asking questions about the value of the cattle herd for months before my grandfather died. Most damaging of all was what I learned from Dr. Philip Kim, the veterinarian who had cared for my grandfather's animals. He told me that Brandon had approached him just days after the funeral, asking him to falsify records that would make it appear the cattle were sick and needed to be sold immediately. When Dr. Kim refused, Brandon had threatened to find another veterinarian who would be more cooperative. Charles Cook compiled all of this information into a legal brief that painted Brandon Peterson as an opportunistic relative who had manipulated an elderly man's trust for his own benefit. But Brandon had his own lawyer now, a man named Sandra Smith, who specialized in inheritance disputes and had a reputation for aggressive tactics. The legal maneuvering escalated quickly. Sandra Smith filed motions claiming that my grandfather had been mentally incompetent when he wrote his will, that I had no real connection to the family, that Brandon had invested too much of his own time and money into the property to be cut out of the inheritance. She requested an immediate injunction to prevent me from interfering with the cattle sale, arguing that the animals needed to be sold quickly to prevent financial loss. I spent my days learning to navigate the complex world of cattle ranching, guided by neighbors who remembered my grandfather fondly and wanted to honor his memory by helping me succeed. Scott Allen taught me how to read feed charts and calculate nutritional requirements. Dr. Kim showed me how to spot signs of illness in the herd and maintain vaccination schedules. Ruth Lee's husband, a retired rancher named Kimberly Collins, spent hours explaining the economics of cattle breeding and the seasonal rhythms that govern farm life. But even as I absorbed this crash course in agriculture, the legal pressure continued to mount. Brandon Peterson seemed to be everywhere, showing up at the farm at odd hours to check on things he claimed were his responsibility, bringing potential buyers to look at cattle he insisted he had the right to sell. His presence felt like a constant threat hanging over everything I was trying to build. The breakthrough came when I was going through my grandfather's personal papers, looking for anything that might help our legal case. Hidden in the bottom drawer of his desk, underneath years of tax returns and veterinary records, I found a leather-bound journal that he had kept for the last 5 years of his life. The entries were sporadic and written in my grandfather's increasingly shaky handwriting, but they told a story that made my blood run cold. He had been suspicious of Brandon's motives for months before his death, noting instances where tools went missing, where cattle counts didn't match his records, where Brandon seemed more interested in the property's value than its care. More importantly, the journal contained detailed accounts of conversations where Brandon had pressured my grandfather to change his will. There were dates and direct quotes, including one entry where my grandfather wrote that Brandon had threatened to abandon him entirely if he didn't receive a larger share of the inheritance. But the most damning evidence was a letter that my grandfather had drafted but never sent, addressed to Charles Cook and dated just 2 weeks before his death. In it, he explicitly stated that Brandon Peterson was never to receive any portion of the cattle herd, and that he suspected Brandon of stealing from the property. He had been planning to revoke Brandon's access to the farm entirely, but cancer had taken him before he could follow through. Charles Cook's eyes lit up when I showed him these documents. This was exactly the kind of evidence we needed to prove that my grandfather's final wishes were being honored by his will, and that Brandon's claims were fraudulent. We immediately filed new motions with the court, requesting that Brandon's access to the property be revoked pending the resolution of our case. But Brandon Peterson wasn't going to give up without a fight. When he received notice of our new evidence, he accelerated his timeline for the cattle sale. Instead of waiting for the court's decision, he announced that the auction would take place the following morning, claiming that emergency circumstances required immediate action to prevent the animals from suffering. I got the call from Charles Cook at 6 in the morning. He was driving to the courthouse to file an emergency injunction, but the auction was scheduled to start at 9, and there was no guarantee we could stop it in time. If Brandon managed to sell even a portion of the herd before we could intervene, it would be nearly impossible to get those animals back. That was when I made the decision to take matters into my own hands. I drove to the farm as fast as I could, my heart pounding as I saw the cars and trucks already gathering for the auction. Brandon had set up a makeshift sale ring in the main pasture, with folding chairs arranged in rows and a portable sound system that crackled with feedback as he tested the microphone. The cattle themselves seemed agitated by all the unusual activity, clustering together at the far end of the field and watching the proceedings with wary eyes. These animals had known my grandfather's voice, his daily routines, his gentle way of moving among them. Now they were being treated like commodities to be divided up and shipped away to unknown destinations. I parked at the edge of the gathering and tried to figure out what to do. There were at least 50 people there, most of them serious-looking men in cowboy hats who had driven hours to bid on what they thought was a legitimate cattle sale. Brandon stood at the center of it all, playing the role of the grieving family member who was reluctantly forced to sell his beloved uncle's herd. That was when I saw Charles Cook's car racing up the driveway, dust flying behind it like a banner of hope. Oh. Charles Cook jumped out of his car with a folder of legal documents in one hand and his cell phone pressed to his ear with the other. He was talking rapidly to someone, probably the judge who had just signed our emergency injunction, as he strode toward the auction ring where Brandon Peterson was preparing to start the sale. I followed close behind him, my heart hammering against my ribs as I realized this was it. This was the moment that would determine whether I kept my grandfather's legacy or lost it forever to a cousin whose greed had twisted family obligation into outright theft. Brandon saw us coming and his face went white, but he was committed now. Too many people had gathered, too much money was at stake, too much of his reputation depended on following through with what he had promised. He grabbed the microphone and started talking fast, welcoming the bidders and explaining the quality of the cattle they were about to purchase. Charles Cook reached the edge of the sale ring and held up the injunction papers, his voice carrying clearly across the pasture as he announced that the sale was illegal and must stop immediately. The potential buyers shifted uncomfortably in their folding chairs, murmuring among themselves as they tried to figure out what was happening. But Brandon Peterson wasn't finished yet. He claimed that Charles Cook was representing an outside party with no legal standing, that the sale had been properly authorized, that any attempt to stop it was actually the illegal action. He pointed at me and told the crowd that I was just a kid from the city who had never seen a cow before, trying to interfere with family business I didn't understand. That was when something inside me snapped. I had spent 18 years being told I didn't belong anywhere, being shuffled from home to home because no one wanted to keep me permanently. I had discovered a grandfather who had fought for me and lost, who had spent years hoping for a reunion that never came. I had inherited a legacy that connected me to generations of family history, and I was not going to let Brandon Peterson take it away with lies and manipulation. I walked into the center of that sale ring and took the microphone right out of Brandon's hands. My voice shook at first as I introduced myself to the gathered bidders, but it grew stronger as I explained who I really was and what this property meant to me. I told them about my grandfather's journal, about the evidence we had found of Brandon's deception, about the legal documents that proved these cattle belonged to me and me alone. But more than that, I told them about what this place represented. I talked about my father's bedroom, preserved for decades by a man who never stopped hoping his family would come home. I described the photographs my grandfather had saved, the newspaper clippings he had collected, the love he had poured into maintaining this farm for a granddaughter he was never allowed to know. The crowd listened in complete silence as I explained that these weren't just cattle to be bought and sold. They were living symbols of my family's heritage, animals that had been bred and raised with care across multiple generations. Selling them would be like selling pieces of my grandfather's soul, scattered to strangers who would never understand their true value. When I finished speaking, the pasture was so quiet I could hear the wind moving through the oak trees. Then Scott Allen, the feed store owner who had known my grandfather for 30 years, stood up from his folding chair and started clapping. One by one, the other neighbors who had come to support me joined in the applause until the sound echoed across the fields like thunder. The potential buyers from other counties looked confused and uncomfortable, clearly realizing they had walked into the middle of a family dispute that was much more complicated than a simple cattle auction. Several of them were already heading back to their trucks, unwilling to get involved in what might turn into a legal nightmare. Brandon Peterson stood there with his mouth hanging open, watching his carefully planned sale collapse around him. Sandra Smith, his lawyer, was frantically making phone calls, probably trying to figure out whether the injunction Charles Cook was waving around was legally valid. But the real victory came when Dr. Philip Kim approached me with a gentle smile and asked if I would like him to help me move the cattle back to the barn area, away from all the commotion. His simple question acknowledged what everyone in that pasture now understood. These were my animals on my land, and I had every right to protect them. The next few hours passed in a blur of legal paperwork and formal statements. Charles Cook and Sandra Smith argued over the validity of various documents, while the potential buyers dispersed and Brandon Peterson grew increasingly desperate in his attempts to salvage something from his failed scheme. But the real work was happening in the pastures, where my neighbors were helping me learn the practical skills I would need to manage my inheritance. Ruth Lee's husband showed me how to move cattle safely from one field to another. Scott Allen explained the feeding schedules my grandfather had maintained in the seasonal rotation patterns that kept the pastures healthy. Dr. Kim gave me a crash course in basic veterinary care, teaching me how to spot signs of illness and injury, how to administer medications, how to maintain the vaccination records that would be crucial for the herd's health. Every lesson felt like a gift from my grandfather, knowledge he would have shared with me himself if he had lived long enough. As the sun began to set over the fields that were truly mine now, I stood in the main pasture surrounded by cattle that no longer seemed like strangers. They had grown accustomed to my voice throughout the day, and several of the more curious ones had approached to investigate this new person who was learning to care for them. Charles Cook found me there as darkness fell, carrying news that Sandra Smith had withdrawn all of Brandon Peterson's legal challenges. Faced with the evidence from my grandfather's journal and the testimony of multiple witnesses to Brandon's deceptive behavior, she had advised her client to accept defeat gracefully, rather than face potential criminal charges for fraud and theft. Brandon himself had left hours earlier, driving away from the farm he had tried to steal with his tail between his legs and his reputation in the community permanently damaged. I felt a mixture of relief and sadness as I watched his truck disappear down the gravel driveway, knowing that this victory had come at the cost of any possibility of real family reconciliation. But as I looked around at the neighbors who had stayed to help me secure the cattle for the night, I realized that family wasn't just about blood relationships. These people had welcomed me into their community, shared their knowledge freely, and stood up for what was right when it mattered most. They had given me something more valuable than any inheritance, a sense of belonging. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of learning and adjustment as I settled into life as a cattle rancher. Every morning brought new challenges and discoveries, from understanding the complex nutritional needs of different animals to mastering the seasonal rhythms that governed everything from breeding schedules to pasture management. Ruth Lee became my unofficial mentor in navigating small-town social dynamics, explaining the unwritten rules and long-standing relationships that shaped how business was conducted in Millbrook. She taught me which suppliers could be trusted, which neighbors were always willing to lend a hand, and which local traditions I should participate in to truly become part of the community. Scott Allen took me under his wing at the feed store, patiently explaining the science behind cattle nutrition and helping me develop feeding programs that would keep my herd healthy throughout the changing seasons. He had known my grandfather since they were both young men starting their careers, and he shared stories that helped me understand the man whose legacy I was inheriting. But it was Dr. Philip Kim who became my most important teacher, spending countless hours showing me how to read the subtle signs that indicated when an animal was healthy, stressed, or developing illness. He taught me to move calmly and confidently among the cattle, understanding that they could sense my emotional state and would respond accordingly. The farmhouse slowly became a home as I made it my own while respecting the memories it contained. I kept my father's bedroom exactly as my grandfather had preserved it, but I claimed the master bedroom for myself, hanging my few possessions alongside the family photographs that lined the walls. In the evenings, I would sit on the front porch with my grandfather's journal, reading his thoughts about the daily life of the farm and the animals he had cared for with such dedication. His words helped me understand not just the practical aspects of ranching, but the deeper philosophy that guided his relationship with the land and the creatures that depended on him. The cattle themselves gradually accepted me as their new caretaker, learning to recognize my voice and my daily routines. There was something deeply satisfying about walking among them in the early morning mist, checking on their health and well-being, knowing that I was continuing a tradition that stretched back through generations of my family. But the real transformation happened slowly, as I began to understand what my grandfather had known all along. This wasn't just about owning land or raising animals for profit. It was about being part of something larger than myself, connected to the cycles of nature and the responsibility of stewardship that came with caring for living creatures. The seasonal changes brought new lessons and challenges. Spring meant calving season, with the excitement and anxiety of helping new life enter the world. Dr. Kim was always on call during those weeks, ready to assist with difficult births or provide emergency care for mothers and babies who needed extra attention. Summer brought the intensive work of haymaking, when the entire community came together to help each family harvest and store the feed that would carry their animals through the winter months. I learned to operate machinery I had never seen before, working alongside neighbors who accepted my inexperience with patience and good humor. Fall was breeding season, requiring careful planning and record keeping to assure the genetic health of the herd for generations to come. My grandfather's meticulous breeding records became my guide, showing me which bloodlines had produced the strongest and healthiest animal over the decades. Winter tested everything I had learned, as harsh weather and shortened daylight hours made every aspect of animal care more challenging. But there was also something beautiful about the quiet months, when the cattle gathered close to the barns and the pace of life slowed to match the natural rhythms of the season. Throughout it all, I felt my grandfather's presence in every decision I made and every skill I acquired. The neighbors often commented that I had inherited more than just his land, that there was something in my approach to the animals, in my instinctive understanding of their needs, that reminded them strongly of Edward Anderson himself. Charles Cook became not just my lawyer, but a trusted advisor, helping me navigate the business aspects of ranching and ensuring that all the legal documentation was properly maintained. He had genuinely cared for my grandfather, and he took obvious pride in seeing the farm continue to thrive under my stewardship. As my first year on the farm drew to a close, I realized that I had found something I had been searching for my entire life without even knowing it. This wasn't just a place to live or a business to run. This was home in the truest sense of the word, a connection to family history and community belonging that no amount of money could buy. The anniversary of my grandfather's death fell on a crisp October morning when the leaves were turning brilliant shades of red and gold. I spent the day walking through every field and pasture, checking on animals that had become as familiar to me as old friends, thinking about the man who had made it all possible. That evening, I found myself in my father's preserved bedroom, looking at the model airplanes and track ribbons that represented dreams cut short by tragedy. But instead of sadness, I felt a sense of completion, knowing that the family line would continue and that the farm would remain in caring hands for another generation. I had started this journey as an 18-year-old aging out of foster care with no family and no future. Now I was a confident young rancher with deep roots in a community that had embraced me as one of their own. The transformation had been gradual but profound, changing not just where I lived, but who I was at the most fundamental level. As winter gave way to spring in my second year on the farm, I began to understand the deeper rhythms that govern not just the cattle and the land, but the entire community that had welcomed me so warmly. Millbrook operated on cycles that stretched back generations, where families supported each other through difficult times and celebrated together during seasons of abundance. The spring calving season brought both triumph and heartbreak, as new life entered the world alongside the inevitable losses that came with the territory. I learned to assist with difficult births, to bottle feed orphaned calves, and to make the hard decisions that sometimes came with caring for animals whose suffering could only be ended with compassion. Dr. Philip Kim was always there to guide me through these challenges, his gentle wisdom helping me understand that death was as natural a part of farming as birth, and that good stewardship sometimes meant making choices that broke your heart but served the greater good of the herd. Ruth Lee continued to be my connection to the social fabric of the town, making sure I was invited to church suppers and community events where I could build relationships beyond the boundaries of agriculture. She understood that belonging to a place meant more than just owning property there, that true integration required participation in the full life of the community. Scott Allen expanded my education beyond cattle care to include the broader economics of farming, teaching me about commodity markets, crop rotation, and the complex web of relationships between ranchers, suppliers, and buyers that kept the agricultural economy functioning. His patience with my endless questions reminded me daily how fortunate I was to have such dedicated teachers. But it was during the summer haying season that I truly felt like I had earned my place in the community. When a severe thunderstorm damaged Scott Allen's hay crop just as it was ready for harvest, the entire neighborhood came together to help salvage what could be saved and share resources to make up for what was lost. I found myself working alongside families who had been farming for generations, contributing my labor and my equipment to a collective effort that transcended individual property lines. The physical exhaustion of working from dawn to dusk in the summer heat was nothing compared to the satisfaction of being truly useful, of having skills and resources that could help my neighbors in their time of need. That was when I realized that my grandfather's legacy wasn't just the land and the cattle he had left me. It was the relationships he had built over decades of being a reliable and generous member of this farming community. I was inheriting not just his property, but his reputation and his responsibilities to the people who had been his friends and neighbors. The second fall brought new challenges as I took on more leadership roles in local agricultural organizations. Charles Cook encouraged me to join the County Cattlemen's Association, where my fresh perspective and growing expertise were welcomed by ranchers who had initially been skeptical of the young city girl who had inherited Edward Anderson's farm. I began attending meetings where decisions were made about everything from grazing rights on public land to regulations governing animal health and safety. My voice carried weight now, not just because of the size of my operation, but because I had proven myself capable of managing my inheritance responsibly and contributing meaningfully to the broader agricultural community. The transformation in my relationship with the cattle themselves was perhaps the most remarkable change of all. What had started as an overwhelming responsibility had evolved into a deep partnership based on mutual respect and understanding. I could read their moods and needs with an intuition that surprised even experienced ranchers like Dr. Kim and Scott Allen. My grandfather's journal entries from years past began to make perfect sense as I experienced the same seasonal challenges and daily rhythms that he had written about. I found myself continuing his tradition of keeping detailed records, not just for practical purposes, but as a way of documenting the ongoing story of this land and these animals for whoever might inherit them after me. The financial aspects of ranching, which had seemed impossibly complex when I first arrived, gradually became manageable as I learned to balance the costs of feed, veterinary care, and equipment maintenance against the income from selling cattle and dairy products. Charles Cook's guidance was invaluable in helping me understand tax implications and long-term planning strategies. But more important than the numbers was the growing realization that I was building something sustainable, something that could continue to thrive for generations to come. Every decision I made was informed not just by immediate needs, but by consideration of how it would affect the long-term health of the land and the animals that depended on it. The community began to see me not as Edward Anderson's granddaughter, who had inherited his farm, but as Sandra Smith, the rancher who had earned her place through hard work and dedication. The distinction was subtle but important, marking my transition from inheritor to owner in the truest sense of the word. Winter brought its own set of rewards as I settled into the quieter rhythms of the cold months. The cattle required different care during the harsh weather, and I had learned to read the signs that warned of approaching storms and the preparations necessary to keep the animals safe and comfortable. Evening hours were spent planning for the coming year, studying breeding charts and market projections, corresponding with other ranchers about best practices and new techniques. The isolation that might have been lonely in my previous life felt peaceful now, filled with purpose and connection to something larger than myself. As my second Christmas on the farm approached, I found myself hosting neighbors for the first time, continuing a tradition my grandfather had maintained of opening his home to community members who might otherwise spend the holidays alone. The farmhouse filled with laughter and conversation as people who had become my chosen family gathered around the table where my grandfather had eaten so many solitary meals. The third year brought a confidence and competence that surprised even me. I had evolved from a frightened teenager clutching an inheritance letter to a respected member of the agricultural community, someone whose opinions were sought and whose expertise was valued by ranchers with decades more experience. The cattle herd had grown under my stewardship, not just in numbers but in quality. As I applied the breeding strategies my grandfather had developed and refined them with new techniques I learned from veterinary journals and agricultural extension programs. Dr. Philip Kim often commented that the animals had never looked healthier or more content. Spring calving season had become my favorite time of year, when the pastures filled with new life and the future of the herd was literally born before my eyes. I had developed an intuitive sense for which cows might need assistance and which could be trusted to manage on their own, skills that came only from years of careful observation and hands-on experience. The community had fully embraced me as one of their own, evident in the way I was included in decision-making processes that affected the entire agricultural district. When the county proposed new regulations for livestock transportation, I was asked to serve on the committee that would draft recommendations, a responsibility that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Ruth Lee often joked that I had become more of a local than some people who had been born in Millbrook, pointing to my deep knowledge of family histories and community traditions that I had absorbed through countless conversations and shared experiences. The diner where we had first met had become my unofficial office, where I conducted business over coffee and pie with suppliers, neighbors, and fellow ranchers. Scott Allen had begun sending new farmers to me for advice, recognizing that my recent experience learning the ropes gave me insights that might be valuable to others, making the transition from other careers to agriculture. Teaching what I had learned felt like a way of honoring all the patient instruction I had received from my mentors. But perhaps the most significant change was in my relationship with the land itself. What had once seemed like an overwhelming responsibility had become a source of deep satisfaction and purpose. I understood now why my grandfather had been willing to fight for custody of a granddaughter he barely knew, why he had preserved this place so carefully for a future he might not live to see. The seasonal cycles that governed everything from planting schedules to breeding programs had become as natural to me as breathing. I could read the weather patterns, predict the needs of the animals, and plan months ahead with the kind of long-term thinking that sustainable agriculture required. Charles Cook had become more than just my lawyer, evolving into a trusted advisor who helped me navigate not just legal issues, but the complex business decisions that came with managing a substantial agricultural operation. His pride in my success was evident every time he visited the farm, seeing how far I had come from the uncertain teenager who had first walked into his office. The farmhouse had truly become my home, filled with my own belongings and memories, while still honoring the family history that connected me to generations of people who had loved this land. I had added my own photographs to the walls, documenting the changes and improvements I had made while preserving the essential character of the place. My father's bedroom remained exactly as my grandfather had kept it, but I no longer saw it as a shrine to loss and regret. Instead, it had become a reminder of the continuity that connected past, present, and future, a tangible link to the family history that I was now actively writing with my own choices and actions. The financial success of the operation had exceeded even Charles Cook's optimistic projections, as my combination of traditional methods and modern innovations produced results that attracted attention from agricultural researchers and fellow ranchers throughout the region. But more important than the money was the satisfaction of knowing that I was building something sustainable and meaningful. Winter evenings were no longer lonely but peaceful, filled with the quiet contentment that came from a day of meaningful work and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. I had learned to appreciate the slower pace of the cold months, using the time for planning and reflection that prepared me for the intensity of spring and summer. The anniversary of my arrival in Millbrook had become a personal holiday, a day when I reflected on the journey that had brought me from foster care to this place of belonging and purpose. Each year, the transformation seemed more remarkable. The distance between who I had been and who I had become almost impossible to measure. As I looked ahead to the future, I began to think about my own legacy, about what I wanted to pass on to the next generation, and how I could ensure that this land would continue to be cared for with the same dedication my grandfather had shown. The responsibility felt less overwhelming now, more like a privilege than a burden. The community had given me more than just acceptance. They had given me a sense of purpose and belonging that I had never experienced before. In return, I had committed myself to being the kind of neighbor and community member that my grandfather would have been proud of, someone who contributed to the collective well-being of everyone around me. By the fourth year, I had not only mastered the technical aspects of cattle ranching, but had begun to innovate in ways that honored my grandfather's traditional methods while incorporating sustainable practices that would ensure the long-term health of the land. The farm had become a model operation that other ranchers visited to learn about rotational grazing techniques and holistic herd management. Dr. Philip Kim and I had developed new protocols for preventive veterinary care that reduced the need for antibiotics while maintaining the health of the animals. Our collaboration had resulted in research papers that were published in agricultural journals, contributing to the broader knowledge base that helped farmers throughout the region improve their practices. The relationship I had built with my cattle had evolved into something that surprised even experienced ranchers. The animals responded to my presence with a calmness and trust that made routine care easier and less stressful for everyone involved. Visitors often commented that they had never seen livestock that seemed so content and well-adjusted. Ruth Lee had become like a grandmother to me, the family connection I had never had growing up in foster care. She was the first person I called when I needed advice about anything, from business decisions to personal challenges. And her wisdom had guided me through countless situations where my inexperience might have led to costly mistakes. Scott Allen had made me a partner in several agricultural initiatives that extended beyond individual farm operations, including a cooperative buying program that helped smaller ranchers access feed and supplies at better prices, and a marketing collective that gave local producers more leverage in negotiating with large buyers. But it was Charles Cook who helped me take the next major step in my development as a rancher and community leader. He suggested that I consider running for election to the County Agricultural Board, a position that would give me a formal voice in policy decisions that affected farmers throughout the region. The campaign was unlike anything I had ever experienced, requiring me to articulate my vision for the future of agriculture in our area and defend my qualifications against candidates who had been farming longer than I had been alive. But the support I received from the community was overwhelming, evidence of how completely I had been accepted as one of their own. Election day brought a decisive victory that surprised even my supporters, as voters from across the county endorsed my platform of sustainable agriculture, support for beginning farmers, and responsible land stewardship. The result was a mandate to represent not just my own interests, but the collective concerns of everyone who depended on agriculture for their livelihood. The responsibilities of elected office added a new dimension to my life, requiring me to balance the daily demands of running my own operation with the broader obligations of serving the agricultural community. Board meetings, policy discussions, and constituent services became regular parts of my schedule, each one an opportunity to advocate for the values my grandfather had instilled in me. But the most meaningful recognition came when the County Agricultural Extension Office asked me to develop a mentorship program for young people interested in farming careers. The program would pair experienced ranchers with newcomers, providing the kind of support and guidance that had been so crucial to my own success. Working with teenagers who reminded me of my younger self was both rewarding and challenging, as I tried to pass on not just technical knowledge, but the deeper understanding of what it meant to be a steward of the land and the animals that depended on human care. Each success story felt like a tribute to all the people who had invested in my own development. The farm itself had become a destination for agricultural tourism, as people from urban areas came to learn about sustainable farming practices and experience the rhythms of rural life. I developed educational programs that taught visitors about everything from soil health to animal behavior, sharing the knowledge I had gained while generating additional income for the operation. The financial success of these diverse activities allowed me to expand my land holdings, purchasing adjacent properties when they became available, and ensuring that they would be managed according to the same principles of sustainability and stewardship that guided my grandfather's original farm. Each acquisition felt like a victory for the values I had inherited along with the land. My relationship with Brandon Peterson had evolved from antagonism to a cautious mutual respect, as he eventually acknowledged that I had proven myself capable of managing the inheritance he had tried to steal. We would never be close, but we could now be civil when our paths crossed at community events or agricultural meetings. The house had been updated and modernized while preserving its historic character, with new systems for heating and cooling that made it more comfortable while reducing its environmental impact. The changes honored the past while preparing for a future that would bring new challenges and opportunities. As I look back on the journey that had brought me from foster care to agricultural leadership, I was struck by how completely my life had been transformed by a single letter from a grandfather I had never known. Every aspect of who I had become could be traced back to that moment when I first learned about my inheritance and decided to fight for it. The cattle that had once seemed like an overwhelming responsibility had become partners in an enterprise that connected me to the land, the community, and the natural cycles that governed all life. Caring for them had taught me patience, responsibility, and the deep satisfaction that came from nurturing other living beings. 5 years after that first terrifying day when I burst through the courthouse doors to stop Brandon Peterson from stealing my inheritance, I stood in the same building for a very different reason. The county was presenting me with an award for outstanding contributions to sustainable agriculture, recognizing not just my individual success, but my role in mentoring other young farmers and advancing environmentally responsible practices throughout the region. The ceremony was attended by many of the same people who had witnessed that dramatic confrontation years earlier, but now they were there to celebrate rather than to bid on cattle that didn't belong to the seller. Charles Cook introduced me with obvious pride, describing the transformation from frightened teenager to accomplished agricultural leader that had taken place over the past half-decade. As I accepted the award, I thought about my grandfather and how proud he would have been to see what his granddaughter had accomplished with the legacy he had preserved for her. The farm that he had maintained through decades of solitary dedication had become a thriving operation that employed several people and contributed significantly to the local economy. But more than the business success, I treasured the relationships that had grown from those early days when neighbors like Ruth Lee, Scott Allen, and Dr. Philip Kim had taken a chance on an inexperienced city girl who knew nothing about cattle ranching. Their patience and generosity had made everything else possible, and their continued friendship remained the most valuable part of my inheritance. The mentorship program I had developed was now in its third year, having successfully helped dozens of young people transition into agricultural careers. Some had started their own operations, others had joined family farms with new skills and perspectives, and all had gained an appreciation for the complexity and importance of sustainable food production. My own operation had expanded to include not just cattle ranching, but also crop production, agritourism, and educational programs that brought urban visitors to experience rural life firsthand. The diversity of activities had made the farm more resilient financially, while creating opportunities to share agricultural knowledge with people who might never otherwise understand where their food came from. The house had become a gathering place for the agricultural community, hosting meetings, celebrations, and informal discussions that strengthened the bonds between farmers throughout the region. The dining room table where my grandfather had eaten so many solitary meals now regularly accommodated groups of 20 or more people who came together to solve problems and plan for the future. My father's preserved bedroom had finally been converted into a library and office space, filled with agricultural journals, research papers, and historical documents that chronicled the evolution of farming practices in our area. The change had been difficult emotionally, but it felt like a natural progression that honored the past while embracing the future. The relationship with the cattle had deepened into something that bordered on the mystical, a communication that went beyond words and touched on the fundamental connections between all living beings. Visitors often commented on the unusual calmness of the animals and the obvious trust they displayed toward their human caretakers. Charles Cook had become like a father to me, filling the role that my grandfather might have played if he had lived longer. His guidance had been crucial, not just in legal and business matters, but in helping me navigate the complex social dynamics of rural communities where relationships often stretch back for generations. The financial success of the operation had allowed me to establish a scholarship fund for young people from foster care who wanted to pursue agricultural education. The fund was named in honor of my grandfather, ensuring that his legacy would continue to create opportunities for others who might otherwise lack the resources to follow their dreams. But perhaps the most significant development was my engagement to Dr. Philip Kim's son, a veterinarian who shared my passion for sustainable agriculture and my commitment to the community that had raised us both. Our wedding was planned for the following spring, when the pastures would be green and filled with new calves, a symbol of the new life we were creating together. The ceremony would take place in the main pasture, surrounded by the cattle that had brought us together and witnessed our courtship over long days of working side by side to ensure their health and well-being. The guest list included not just family and friends, but the entire agricultural community that had become our extended family. As I looked toward the future, I saw possibilities that extended far beyond my own lifetime. The farm would continue to thrive under our joint stewardship. The land would be cared for according to principles of sustainability that would preserve it for future generations. And the traditions of hospitality and community support that my grandfather had embodied would be passed on to our children. The scared 18-year-old who had clutched an inheritance letter and wondered if she belonged anywhere, had evolved into a confident woman who knew exactly where she belonged and what her purpose was. The transformation had been gradual but complete, touching every aspect of who I was and who I aspired to become. The cattle that grazed peacefully in the fields beyond the courthouse windows were living symbols of that transformation, creatures whose care had taught me responsibility, patience, and the deep satisfaction that came from nurturing life. They had been my teachers as much as my charges, showing me what it meant to be truly connected to the land and the cycles of nature. As I stood there holding that award, surrounded by the community that had become my chosen family, I realized that the real prize wasn't the recognition or the financial success or even the beautiful farm that I had inherited. The real prize was the sense of belonging that I had found, the knowledge that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The journey from foster care to agricultural leadership had been filled with challenges that had seemed impossible to overcome, but each obstacle had taught me something valuable about resilience, determination, and the power of community support. The people who had believed in me when I didn't believe in myself had made all the difference, their faith becoming the foundation for my own confidence. Looking back now, I could see that my grandfather's greatest gift hadn't been the land or the cattle or even the financial security that came with them. His greatest gift had been the opportunity to discover who I really was when given the chance to put down roots and build something meaningful with my own hands. The farm had become more than just my home and my business. It had become a living testament to the power of second chances and the importance of preserving traditions while adapting to changing times. Every decision I made was informed by respect for the past and responsibility for the future, a balance that honored my grandfather's legacy while creating my own. The cattle that had once seemed like an overwhelming burden had become my partners in creating something beautiful and sustainable, their trust and dependence motivating me to become the best steward I could be. Their presence in my daily life had taught me patience, observation skills, and the deep satisfaction that came from caring for other living beings. The community relationships that had started with skepticism and uncertainty had evolved into bonds that would last a lifetime, connections based on shared values, mutual respect, and the kind of practical cooperation that rural life required. These people had become my chosen family, filling the void that foster care had never been able to heal. The house that had once felt like a museum to someone else's life had become truly mine, filled with my own memories and accomplishments, while still honoring the family history that connected me to generations of people who had loved this land. Every room told a story of growth, learning, and the gradual process of becoming who I was meant to be. The financial independence that the farm had provided was important, but it was secondary to the sense of purpose and meaning that came from doing work that mattered. Every day brought new challenges and opportunities to make a positive difference, whether in the lives of the animals under my care, or the young people I was mentoring, or the community I served. The leadership roles I had assumed felt natural now, extensions of the responsibility and stewardship that farming had taught me. Speaking up for sustainable practices, advocating for beginning farmers, and working to preserve agricultural land for future generations had become as important to me as the daily care of my own cattle. The recognition I had received was gratifying, but it was also humbling, a reminder that individual success was always built on the foundation of community support and the sacrifices of previous generations. My grandfather's decision to preserve the farm for a granddaughter he had never met had created opportunities that extended far beyond my own life. As the ceremony concluded and people began to drift away, I found myself walking back toward the farm, drawn by the need to check on the cattle and ensure that all was well in the world I had built. The familiar routines of animal care grounded me, reminding me that beneath all the recognition and awards was the simple, essential work of caring for living creatures. The sun was setting as I reached the main pasture, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink that reflected off the pond where the cattle came to drink. The animals gathered around me as they always did, their calm presence a reminder of how far we had all come together since that first terrifying day when I had known nothing about their care. Standing there surrounded by cattle in the golden light of evening, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this place. Every challenge had been worth it. Every moment of doubt and fear had led to growth and understanding. Every relationship had contributed to the person I had become. The future stretched ahead full of possibilities, from the wedding that would unite two families committed to agricultural stewardship, to the children who would someday inherit this land and continue the traditions we were building, to the countless young people who would benefit from the programs and opportunities we were creating. But in that moment, surrounded by the gentle presence of the cattle and the familiar sights and sounds of home, I was content to simply be present, to appreciate the gift of belonging that my grandfather had made possible, and to honor his memory by living each day with the same dedication to the land and the community that had defined his life. The scared teenager who had burst through courthouse doors to claim her inheritance had found something more valuable than land or cattle or financial security. She had found home, purpose, and the deep satisfaction that came from knowing exactly where she belonged in the world. Now, 7 years later, as I sit on the porch of the farmhouse where my grandfather once waited for a family that never came home, I can see my own children playing in the yard where my father once ran as a boy. The circle has been completed, the legacy has been passed on, and the land that was preserved through decades of hope and faith continues to nurture new generations. My husband and I have built something beautiful together, combining his veterinary expertise with my agricultural knowledge to create an operation that serves as a model for sustainable farming practices throughout the region. Our children are growing up with the same connection to the land and animals that shaped my grandfather's values and my own character. The mentorship program has expanded into a full scholarship foundation that helps young people from disadvantaged backgrounds pursue agricultural careers, ensuring that the opportunities I received will be available to others who might otherwise lack the resources to follow their dreams. Each success story feels like a tribute to my grandfather's belief in the power of second chances. The farm itself has become a destination for agricultural education, hosting school groups, university students, and urban families who want to understand where their food comes from and how sustainable practices can preserve the land for future generations. The programs we offer have reached thousands of people, spreading knowledge and awareness that extends far beyond our own property lines. The community that welcomed me so warmly continues to evolve and grow, but the core values of cooperation, stewardship, and mutual support remain constant. New families arrive regularly, drawn by the quality of life and the opportunities that rural communities can offer. And we work to ensure that they receive the same kind of welcome and support that made my own transition possible. The cattle that were once threatened by Brandon Peterson's greed have multiplied into a herd that is recognized throughout the region for its genetic quality and health. They graze peacefully in pastures that are more productive and sustainable than ever before, living symbols of what can be accomplished when traditional wisdom is combined with modern knowledge and genuine care. The house has been expanded and updated to accommodate our growing family, but the essential character remains unchanged, a place where hospitality and tradition are honored while embracing the future with optimism and purpose. The dining room table still hosts community gatherings, and my father's former bedroom has become a nursery where the next generation is beginning their own journey. Charles Cook remains our trusted advisor and friend, now helping us plan for the transfer of the farm to our children when the time comes. His pride in what we have accomplished is evident every time he visits, seeing how the scared teenager he once represented has become a leader in her community and a guardian of agricultural traditions. Ruth Lee, now in her 80s, still holds court at the diner where she first welcomed me to Millbrook, regaling visitors with stories of the city girl who inherited a farm and transformed herself into one of the most respected ranchers in the county. Her friendship has been one of the greatest gifts of my new life, a reminder that family is created through love and loyalty rather than just blood relationships. Dr. Philip Kim continues to care for our animals with the same dedication he showed when I was learning the basics of cattle management, but now he works alongside his son and daughter-in-law in a practice that serves the entire agricultural community. The partnership between our families has strengthened both operations and created opportunities that neither could have achieved alone. Scott Allen has retired from active farming, but he remains involved in the cooperative programs we develop together, using his decades of experience to guide new initiatives that help smaller operations compete in an increasingly challenging agricultural marketplace. His mentorship was crucial to my early success, and his continued friendship enriches our entire community. As I watch my children discover the same wonder in newborn calves and changing seasons that captivated me as a young adult, I understand more deeply what my grandfather was trying to preserve when he fought for custody of a granddaughter he had never met. He was protecting more than just land and livestock. He was safeguarding a way of life that connected people to the natural world and to each other in meaningful ways. The transformation that began with a single letter has rippled outward to touch countless lives, creating opportunities and possibilities that extend far beyond what any of us could have imagined. The farm that was almost lost to greed and legal manipulation has become a force for positive change in our community and beyond. If you've made it this far in my story, I hope you'll take a moment to share where you're watching from and tell us about your own experiences with unexpected opportunities or family connections you never knew existed. Have you ever inherited something that changed your life completely? Have you found family in unexpected places? Your stories matter, and I'd love to hear them in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoyed this journey from foster care to agricultural leadership, and share this video with anyone who might be inspired by the power of second chances and the importance of community support. Sometimes the most important inheritance isn't money or property, but the opportunity to discover who you're meant to become when given the chance to put down roots and build something meaningful. The scared 18-year-old who once clutched an inheritance letter and wondered if she belonged anywhere has found her place in the world. But more importantly, she has learned that home isn't just a place you inherit. It's a place you create through love, dedication, and the willingness to invest in something larger than yourself. That lesson is one I hope to pass on to my children, and through them to future generations who will continue to care for this land and this community long after I'm gone.